thanks very much, Leanne, and thanks everyone for being so incredibly patient. There's something almost charming about being in an art school where the tech stuff doesn't work and hundreds of new media artists don't rush to the aid to fill the void. So for Christopher and for David, this is obviously an old home week of sorts, so we're all really pleased to be here. So we're starting talking with the image of the 1975 show at Susan Caldwell of David's work that really started the exhibition, which took several years to germinate. And it really started at the Guggenheim Museum, where I was giving a talk during Christopher's retrospective there. And I put this slide up on the screen during the talk. And Christopher, can you say something about what you thought when you saw it, or?
Well, so the exhibition of the paintings was in 1975, and I had been at the studio school in 73, 74. I think I knew David's name and must have seen the show because I recognized the name, even though it was at Susan Caldwell Gallery, which was a gallery that I remember seeing other exhibitions of. But it was a particularly important exhibition for me at the time, but I was 19 years old. And I remembered it very well, but had not seen, certainly never seen an installation photo again. This Guggenheim show was just 3 years ago, so there was 40 years time had passed. And I certainly hadn't seen any of the paintings. I'd seen a couple reproductions. So when Katy showed this, I was surprised. I didn't know Katy at the time, and was surprised and impressed, and we started talking, which I actually asked if she knew where any of the paintings were, and it kind of led to the idea of trying to make an exhibition. We didn't know if we'd be able to put together a group of the paintings, but it turns out David had kept pretty good track of where his paintings were.
I mean, one of the great pleasures of doing an exhibition with an artist is they say something like, "Gee, I'd like to see all those paintings," and suddenly you're chasing the paintings all down, and they're all over the world. So that was part of the fun, was finding what was there, and then part of what was difficult but interesting was also seeing how much of the work had been destroyed, following its path through the years. And the pleasure of writing history with two artists is that you're sort of freed from the sort of art historical method of tracing everything in a single line. And this exhibition ended up, in the book that goes with it, ended up being really about two people facing each other from two different generations, two artists with about 10 years separating them, and also facing their younger selves. So for students, I think it's hard to imagine what your work will look like to you in 40 years, and what you'll think about your younger self when you're 40 years older. But the exhibition also came at around big birthdays for Christopher and for David, and I think there's a lot of that moment of looking back at your younger self and wondering what the work would look like when you got to see it again, and what it would mean to you. And so it's obviously especially true for David, as Christopher and I were running around trying to find all the work. Some things we didn't get in Paris or in Tel Aviv, but we got a lot of the work. Most of the work that still exists is in this exhibition. And so Christopher and I installed the show first at the Rose Museum at Brandeis University outside Boston, and then David just showed up. So I guess I would love to hear what you thought when you walked into that room with all that work.
Oh boy, it was just overwhelming for me to see all that work again after more than 40 years. I think I'd never expected that to really happen again. I was happy to see the paintings still look strong to me, and I was very happy to be able to see them again and think about them again. And at the same time, it brought back a lot of emotions from that time, which was a very difficult time for me. So it was a very complex mix of different emotions that I was feeling.
So I wanted to, here's the work in New York City. If you haven't seen the show, you have another week to go up to Gagosian on Madison Avenue and see it. And the work is quite powerful in person, more than in these images, which are beautiful. I think people would be a little bit surprised because you identify yourself as a Californian in the introduction, sort of where you come from. You know, people think of you as a New York painter because you've been here for so long. So could you talk a little bit about that beginning moment and maybe make some connection to where that ended up in 1975?
This is my family's house in San Diego on Point Loma. I grew up in paradise there. The house was designed by my uncle, who was an architect. It's now a historically designated building and can't be changed. They call it the icon of modernism in San Diego. Of course, I didn't realize that at the time, but I knew it was a wonderful house. And sometimes, I certainly tell my uncle that anything good that's happened in my paintings comes from growing up in a house like this that was open to the outside, open to the light, had an exchange between inside and outside.
Mm-hmm. And so you had two uncles.
Yes.
And so one was the architect who built the house, and this is O.P. Reed.
This is my other uncle who was a painter. He'd been trained at Yale and moved to Los Angeles and became a gallerist. At first, he showed contemporary art, was the first to show John McLaughlin's work.
Mm-hmm. This is McLaughlin.
I think we're missing.
No, that's actually a painting. You can see the little black stripes at the bottom.
Oh!
It's like a joke about minimalism.
Yes, McLaughlin's very zen, but not quite
Yes.
to a white canvas.
And so,
He showed McLaughlin and then became a dealer in German Expressionist prints and drawings and formed a collection that's at the County Museum. He was a very difficult and cantankerous person.
Mm-hmm.
He was never supportive of me as a painter, I should say. And it's fun, there's a thumbprint of his on one of the paintings that he touched when he was in my studio and kind of smeared the edge, which seems typical of him. Yeah.
I mean, one of the show has, the process of making the show was a lot of relationships that were a little bit surprising, and one of them was when Larry Gagosian said he would take the show, which is unusual because it's a historical, scholarly exhibition, and he doesn't represent either Christopher or David. I thought he was being nice to Christopher and I because we had both worked with him a little bit, but it was really David because O.P. Reed was a mentor for Larry Gagosian when he was starting out in Los Angeles. So it was a strangely personal connection for someone who's thought of as a money person, a market person. Could you say something about what McLaughlin hung in his Malibu home?
Yes.
And the importance of that kind of California painting for you?
Yes. When I was a teenager, my parents took us to stay with my aunt and uncle who were renting a house on the coast in Malibu. And in one of the bedrooms, there was a John McLaughlin painting, very stark, black and white, geometric painting. And I overheard my parents making fun of it. So you can imagine I loved it. And I wanted to find out all about it. Since they didn't understand it, I wanted to understand it. Mm-hmm. And so I was determined to figure it out. And I especially love McLaughlin now because of the way his paintings are a kind of puzzle, and you try to figure them out, mm-hmm. and you can never resolve them.
Mm-hmm. I think there's something about and I know Christopher was very patient, sitting through all the West Coast stuff, which is not his thing. But I think there's something of that opening of the possibility of illusionism that
Yes.
comes from West Coast painting that you can see a trace of in David's work. And this is David's really early work. Do you want to just say something?
Well,
Tell us what this is.
When I was here at the studio school, I guess I was a bit of a troublemaker. And when I started at the school, it was the second year on Broadway and Bleecker.
Mm-hmm.
And they had decided they would buy this building where we are now. And I happened to be the president of the students then, and I thought it was a bad idea. I didn't like this building because it was so broken up.
Mm-hmm.
The other building was one big loft, so you had to fight as a student to get space. And I liked being aware of everyone else. So I had a vote, and almost, I wanted to dissolve the school. I'm surprised. I'm surprised Mercedes put up with me. So I more or less had to leave town for a while. And I went to the Southwest to paint the landscape. I'd read that Jackson Pollock had been a trail guide at the Grand Canyon. I thought that was the home of American painting. So I went there.
That's Pollock.
This is a picture I found of him as a teenager on the edge of the Grand Canyon.
With his father, who was a surveyor.
And I thought that experience of the Grand Canyon is in his paintings, and I wanted that big space, I would say, in my paintings. So a friend of mine, Charles Munch, and I got in our Volkswagen and drove out to the Southwest to paint. And I was out there again for 2 summers, and this is one of the paintings done there.
And there's always, for me, there's that connection to the landscape, and obviously in Southern California where you come from, but there's almost also a mystical, and I have no idea, I've never asked you about the drugs or anything like that, but there is the feeling of, I don't know, I've known you so long, I can't believe I've never asked that question, but there's a feeling with some of these, like in this with the bush, that there's something dark in it, and it opens like a door, and there's that feeling of space that opens up, and that's something that came up again and again when we were going through the show and talking about whether things were, we'll get to that, whether things were flat and opaque or whether they opened up, and that sense of opening was really a West Coast phenomenon. And I guess that sense of space and Pollock and being on the edge of the canyon showed up in this piece that you wrote in 1975 in Art Right, the same year of the show. Can you say, what is that feeling of Pollock and being on the edge of the canyon and jumping that comes out in this piece? Is that connected to Pollock and being in the Grand Canyon?
Yes, it certainly is. I like that big space, and I guess I realize now how much I wanted to be in it and a part of it, and take chances to do that. I used to sit on the side of the shack that I was renting and look at the clouds moving by and would imagine paintings coming across, and then I would expand them until they got bigger and bigger. And it was only the Pollocks or the Rothkos or the de Koonings that could get big enough to fill that big space. And I took that to be a kind of test for painting, whether they could survive that space.
So this is something, like I said, this is something that Christopher and I argued about and didn't always agree about, or he didn't always feel connected to this part of it. So it's a project when you have working with 2 people that there'll be misses as well as, you know, as a lot of connections. So when we got to New York, that's where Christopher really kicked in, and their interests started to overlap. So you had this sort of West Coast illusionism, feeling of possibilities of transcendence even, and transcendence is, you know, such a no-no in New York. I can remember being in graduate school and being the assistant for Richard Schiff working on a Sarah catalog, and I had to call Sarah and fact check for him, and he said, just no fucking transcendence, and that's just like hung up, and that was the fact check. So what's interesting for me is that David is that meeting place between those things. So this is the anti-illusion catalog from the Whitney. And so what happened when what did you, and I know Mary Heilman is here and Dorothea and some other people maybe who this show resonated for as well.
That show was very important to me because I could see that the sculptors were very involved in process, and that's what they were relying on. And I first of all just loved the work, but then looking back, I can see now that I was using a lot of those same ideas for my work as well. And at the time, it wasn't very accepted that as a painter, I would be looking at the sculptors and very interested in that.
And go ahead, Christopher.
Except, tell me if I'm wrong, at the time, it was pretty much generally agreed on that the sculpture was the medium of the moment,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
painting was not.
Yeah, most definitely, that's true. Yeah, very true.
And I think your paintings, this group of paintings is unusual in that sense. So when we started discussing the show, the California came last because we started with the most obvious connections. And what I think surprised both Katie and I is how little painting, either from that time or since '75, specifically deals with the issues that David was dealing with these paintings. While there were many sculptors and postmodern artists, also video and other things that were much more specifically dealing with these issues.
This is, yeah, so there's quite a bit of film, Paul Scherritz and Ernie Gare, that people were looking at the same time as Anti-Illusion.
That's a little before my time. So.
Yes, yeah, this is
When you're
just before, this is 67, 69. This work is late 60s. So this is stuff that is just before Christopher really comes and starts looking, but it also, but it resonates with that sense of materiality, I think, that you liked, and directness and process that you were attracted to, even though you didn't actually see I think we realized you didn't see the show.
I didn't see the Anti-Illusion show,
Yeah.
but some of the '70s artists so I was new to New York in the '70s, but the '70s sculptors were also, and we have many in the catalog. We just started taking cell phone shots of catalogs, sending them back and forth with each other, discussing, and when we got to it was before the Californian. When we got to the discussions of painting as a door, that's when we had our one long-standing disagreement. I still can't see it quite the way.
We'll get there.
Yeah.
But I think that's the part where it
Another 40 years.
Yes. You'll call me on your deathbed and say, "I'm sorry, you were correct." So this is David looking around at sculpture and film that has a directness that he doesn't see in painting, and a materiality and a sense of process. And then at the same time, and just before, he's here at the studio school. And so I guess I wanted to hear from both of you, because you were here not overlapping, but not super far apart. What was the studio school then?
It was a strange place. We're in this room where I had a critique with Philip Guston in the 60s, where we put our paintings up around the floor. And as a student, I used
There's the back of Guston.
And I'm in the back to the left, next to my friend Richard Mock.
There's David.
I used to stick my head in that door when they had a lecture in this room, covered with paint, wondering whether I should stop painting for a while and listen to this stuff, whether it was worthwhile. I give them a couple minutes and then often turn around and go back to my painting. I was one of those difficult art students, I think. For me, it opened my eyes to what painting could be. I especially studied with Milton Resnick. I learned a lot from Morton Feldman, and it was a whole new world for me. The first time I heard Milton talking, I swear I didn't understand a single word of what he said, but I was determined that I would figure it out. And I started meeting with him and talking privately. I even wrote some poetry, and he critiqued my poetry, and I learned as much from that as I did about critiquing the paintings. And slowly I began to understand things, and it opened a whole world to me.
What was the school known for, and why did you end up here?
I was a student at Reed College, and I heard about the school through a mailing that they had sent out saying it was started by students. It was a breakaway school with students from Pratt, and I liked the idea that students had founded their own school and that they wanted to bring in artists that they respected, to teach them, and not have classes, but just be able to work on their work and be able to talk to painters they respected. And I thought that was the right way to learn about art. I hated the idea of classes, learning technique. I wanted to be painting and then learn things myself.
And were you uncomfortable being in a school? Was it weird and disjunctive to be in a school with all painters, but then be running around looking at work that was in all different media?
No, I think they brought people from other media to the school, and certainly Feldman was a musician. There was some openness to that, I would think.
Yeah, it was, the lecture program here has, I think, I can't speak. It was very open at the time and impressive. Mercedes knew everyone in the New York art world, and for her, the lecture program was extremely important. So we had all kinds of I think the lecture program was more open than the teaching was, I think. So we got and being in New York, it was ideal. I think we got a lot of, we learned a lot that way. It was not just painters by any means.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and always trying to get out and think about bigger ideas in connection with painting, both the visiting artists that were painters and other visiting artists. They wanted to talk about writers, other kinds of art, not just about painting itself.
And how did you end up here, Christopher? And did you?
It was really simple. I knew about schools like the Art Students League. I was out of it somehow. I moved here in September and realized all the schools had already started and it was too late. And the studio school was the only one still open. I saw Holly Zausner's here. We were the last two people interviewed, and so it chose me. I didn't choose it.
And so, when you came here, this is not a great image, but this is Christopher's early photograph, sort of drifting away. But when you came here, you had come from Sarah Lawrence, where you
I had studied with Poussin d'Art for a year, and I was fortunate also. I studied with Jack Twerkoff here, which was important for me. When you first asked about the studio school, I didn't know what to say, but then the thing, I don't think anyone said it, but the school was really drawing based, and I don't know if that has endured. It was really Mercedes who, and even for her own work, was really dedicated to drawing, and I think it was incredibly influential, but not so much at the time. I think as I became an artist and moved from being a student, I realized how much more I had learned here than what I'd been aware of, and it stuck with me still now.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that was also surprising about going through the project was how much you and Joyce Penzato, who's here and was your studio mate then, how much you're still New York Studio School artists in a way.
Yeah.
And how circular it has been throughout your career, that we kept coming up with bodies of work and that related to what you had done here, which I think no one would associate a school that seems to have gotten some sort of, conservative reputation during those years for being a painting place when stuff was happening elsewhere, became the foundational for some really exciting and experimental work. I think people wouldn't make that connection.
No, but Mercedes was a great fan of art and at the highest level, and I think maybe as a late teen it was hard to see that, but I realized it over time. And I, also with the faculty, it was strong here.
And so, Steve Sloman.
Steve Sloman, yes.
Do you want to say anything about this work and its about Sloman's work or the?
Well, he was an important character, but I did not study with him. It was for I was only a first-year student, and I only made it through 1 year here. But he was a big influence and figure in the school, and I think a little bit like David, I would have known his name and saw these early shows of his in the 70s. And he had a studio in the building, so we learned from stuff like that. And Guston was the sort of by the time I was here, he was very much in the background. He taught for only 1 day during the year, but he was the figure in the background, and probably different from David's time. He was at the height of the beginning of his late work. So the mid-70s shows of Guston's that were at McKee when he was in the Barbizon Plaza Hotel were major events.
Can you remember what people said about those shows?
Yes, I was going to say, when I was here, it was a bit earlier, and Guston was living in the studio up above and was just beginning the first of his figurative drawings and then paintings. And it's a difference between generations. I think you talk about it in the interview, how I did not like that transition of Guston's. I didn't understand it, and it upset me. I liked him, and I liked hearing about painting from him. But I didn't understand what he was doing until quite a bit later. And I think Christopher accepted it more from the beginning, or understood it more from the beginning.
I don't remember how, but it did, and I probably was too young for Guston during the transition, which was 1970, I think.
Yeah.
So, but anyone looking at his work in the mid-70s would have been aware of earlier work, but I did not have trouble with it made sense to me and didn't. It was like de Kooning painting the women. It seemed completely possible to me, and not a difficult transition, but I was seeing it in retrospect. So,
But also seeing it as a younger person, it makes you conscious of how the same moment looks so different to people of different ages.
Yes.
So for Christopher, not having to get over a prohibition against illusionism, not having to get over a prohibition against that kind of figuration, history looks much different than it would be for someone who was struggling with those issues. And both of you have been super frank. You were both so young. I mean, you were 19, basically, when you came. You were both so young, and you've been really frank about all the mistakes you made and the things you didn't understand. And I think it's unusual and nice for a younger artist to see two people who basically don't have a lot of early work, because both of you were always telling me, it's terrible, I threw it all out, or I destroyed it all, and nothing is really mature till later. So this is Christopher's loft. There's still someone who's not identified in this picture, isn't there?
Yes, with her
So-
back to us, but I have a sense who it is.
Oh, you-
Maybe, I have a guess.
If anybody knows who the young woman is sitting down,
She may be here, actually.
or yes, if that's you, please stand up and identify yourself. I also wanted to mention one of the teachers that came that when Christopher was here is Bryce Martin, one of the people that you remembered speaking.
Yes, a perfect example of the kind of artist that was coming through here and was specifically someone Mercedes knew. Bryce was, I think, 30 years old at the time, but he was already a very important painter. I remember a good story with this. He was asked, he gave a seminar. It was not a lecture. He came and met with students, I think just for a few hours. I don't remember it being a big production. And there were not so many students who were interested, so it was a small thing. But he was asked to come and was supposed to be here at, I think, 10:30 one morning and didn't show up. And I remember Mercedes cursing at the I forget what his position was, but the person down once, you never invite a New York artist to show up before noon. And that, I knew I was at the right place. That was a good, and I have not forgotten that. He showed up eventually in the afternoon.
This is a still from the Godard film that Martin used for an announcement for a show during that time, and it was an ad in Art Forum. And for me, because it was important, surprisingly, for Christopher and for David, and so it also for me is an image that is very much Christopher and David on either side of a door. That's a painting, and sort of meeting each other and not meeting at the same time, but maybe you have two different reasons. You have different reasons for liking the image.
Were you aware of this ad?
Yes,
Oh,
I
you were,
was,
'cause,
and I thought it was very striking. Yeah.
It certainly was for me. I don't think I saw the ad itself. I think I read critics writing about it, but I'm not sure. But that,
Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe wrote about it in Art Forum the next year.
and we've not been able to find.
No, even Bryce doesn't have the Manil. Nobody has. If you have this invitation, please,
Yeah.
please let me know.
Because I remembered it
Nobody
was
has
on
it.
the invitation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for me, it was part of a really important learning experience, understanding that Bryce Martin's monochrome or multi-panel paintings could be about something like this photograph was. I mean, I was young, but that could be was a big revelation to me and really important.
And so what did it represent as being behind the painting?
Well, yeah, we've disagreed a little bit. At the time, my interpretation was this dividing, a world of two different, these characters are existing in two different worlds. I didn't see it pictorially or illusionistically. I saw it as a statement, and I probably read this from the Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe. I don't think I reread it, but I saw it as in psychological terms, two characters. But whatever, that was very important to me.
I mean, for me, one of the things I learned from Bryce's early paintings was that they hid so much. So much art you see tries to reveal itself completely to a viewer, and you could see with his paintings he pulled back and you couldn't really go through, you were blocked, and that made you want to try harder to go through. And it showed me that in art maybe holding back a little and making the viewer work more was a good thing and improved the work. And I had similar experiences with Warhol as well, where I could see the painting looked very cool. It'd be a car accident and look very cool, and I would get very emotional. And I realized that the painting provoked that in me, and that the painting didn't have to be expressionist for me to get feeling, but it could happen in other ways.
So what seems so simple opens up in this incredible way, and you can see that in the work. So these are the installation shots from Caldwell, and so now we're up to 1975. Go ahead.
Can you go back to the photo of mine, because I didn't ever see this before, but it has the same, the photo has the same composition as what I was seeing. I know I said I didn't see it pictorially, but the same composition as the Godard photo.
Yes, it does.
It's kind of split.
Yeah, it does. And I think that split is something that David talks about, that split sense, and this is the door painting, the series right before the black and white paintings. And so you can see David's moving into that sense of horizontal brushstrokes. Do you want to say how you moved into those 1974, 75 paintings?
Yes, I had a show at Susan Caldwell, a group show, and we had about 6 of these paintings up, and I noticed there were bands in the paintings, usually to the left, that looked to me like maybe they could be paintings by themselves. So I just measured the widths of those bands, and it was about 11 inches, and I thought, I'll do something that's not too difficult while the show is up. I'll just get some stretchers that size, and I decided to paint it very directly, just to make
You can see those
wet
are
on
those
wet and let the paint drip down. And I did it a black and white painting first, thinking that'd be the simplest. And I was lucky enough to realize that I had done something that was better than the paintings before. And I kind of stopped and looked at it and used that as a start for something new.
And that sense of the split is in there.
Yes, all those paintings, what had happened with the earlier paintings is I struggled with myself. I wanted to be both inside the painting, the way Pollock talked about that, but I also wanted to be aware of the whole painting, what I was doing, and to do that you have to see it from outside. I wanted to see everything I was doing. Perhaps that came from Resnick's ideas about seeing the whole painting. And those two experiences at one time made me feel like I was split, and I couldn't get myself back together again. And I felt it was very uncomfortable, unpleasant experience. Now I feel that it's a part of painting and you have to learn to live with it. But at the time it upset me a lot, and I decided I'd work very quickly so I wouldn't have to put up with it. And that's one reason I did these paintings fast the way I did.
Did you feel like you were failing while you were doing them, failing to capture that presentness?
Something happened with the first painting of the group, this number 26. As I was painting, I was watching the paint flow down and trying to be conscious in both of these ways, inside each mark and aware of the whole painting. And I could see something happening that I think had to do with the movement of the paint coming down. And that changed forever the way I saw painting. And painting was different for me from then on. And I put the painting down on the ground to stop the movement. It was an important experience for me, and led to all the paintings that followed. And they were painted very quickly. They only take half a minute, 2 minutes. And during that time, I experienced something as a painter, and I think a viewer experiences something similar.
I think it's something that didn't get into the book because there was just too much, was that I felt like there was a connection there to Guston's one-shot paintings, those small works, sort of early figurative works, where he tried to do them all at once. You know, and other people do this, Luke Toymans does it, other people do paintings all at once, but to try and get the feeling, you know, and so we don't think of him as a process person, but it's to try and stay inside that feeling for the duration.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of those early Guston's figurative works that way, but now I see it.
To do it all at once. So did you obviously didn't know any of that. You didn't know David. Why did you sense any of it? Did it seem just direct to you? Why was it so exciting?
Good question. All of those things, I think, but I may not have, I don't remember. I know the show was impressive and I was taken with it. I remember discussing it with studio school friends of mine who we would do studio visits, whatever. I stayed in close touch with a group of friends who had studied here. I think most of us saw the show, but putting words to it, I know there were certain, for example, when I saw the show, I assumed the single panel paintings were pieces of the larger paintings, which now that I know that wasn't true, I can see that it was obviously not true. But
no, it's true in some cases, and you're pointing that out to me in the way the two of you have installed the show makes me see them as something special. When sometimes I would paint two across and just keep the right canvas.
oh, I didn't know
Remember
that.
that with the rows on the right wall? The two of them were originally
Yeah,
together.
there's some of them that are painted that way, just the way you imagined. And I'm very interested in that now, and I see more how different they are than the other paintings. So I think you were right.
And then something we haven't mentioned about those paintings, but once they became multi-panel and David's not using one large rectangular canvas, but is putting the panels together, and what those divisions did physically was a big part of their presence, for sure.
And what was that? What
Well,
was that
kind of
11 break?
That kind of skipping the pressure on linen versus stretcher bar affected the process, which became the image.
So it's just another way of registering
Yeah.
the process. And you can see one of them,
Yes, absolutely.
David dropped when he was, and so it's like a seismograph, you know, where the paint goes down and then comes back up. So they are sensitive that way.
I mean, we've had, as a part of this process of our exploration of these paintings, I've tried to repaint a couple of them that were destroyed. I think Christopher from the beginning thought this was not going to work, and I think in the end he's probably right, but I've learned a lot from trying to do it, and one of them is how difficult it is to get it to go across that edge the way I did in these paintings.
I didn't think it was a bad idea. I was hesitant about showing them with these.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
was my
Yeah,
only
that's
hesitation.
a very clear point, yeah.
But it's an interesting part of that going back.
Yes, it has been for me, and I realize now that going over that seam, at the time I thought of it as just a physical impediment that slowed down the speed of the mark so that it wouldn't be a gesture that was about imagination, but about physicality as well. And now I see that it's also demonstrating, as it goes over that seam, a physical process made visible and into something that you see rather than feel or see as physicality, know as physicality. And that slight warp that you see with the canvas giving and then becoming more stable as the structures are together is an important part of that. And it makes a slight space in the paintings that wouldn't be there if they were on a flat board, for example. And that's important, yeah.
So when I heard how important an issue anti-illusion was to painters of the time, David telling the stories, I was a little surprised. But the way you used the paint, that it was wet into wet and a heavy physical wet, and getting everything up on the surface like that is a typical strategy for non-illusionistic painting.
Yes.
The physical quality of the paint. Apparently, people were upset because if you have a line, you have a horizon line, and that became illusion. I think that's just retarded, but the things were that rigid. But the fact that, I don't know if I saw it at the time, but that it's so much like writing, that David would move from left to right and top to bottom, and that they had this physical presence. They were about as non-illusionistic as anything. Well, okay, Twombly also, but.
Yeah, I think at the time I also didn't make much of a connection to writing, but thinking back on them, I realized I was dyslexic when I was younger, and they're kind of a demonstration about I know left from right, and I know now how to read because I can tell the difference.
I think that was one of the things I felt so silly when we were talking in the interview and Christopher brought up Twombly and going from left to right and feeling a canvas, that I had looked at David's work so much and never thought that, oh, it's like not only like Twombly, but it's like writing and moving across the canvas, and that was something this is another time when Christopher's work cycled through in those early paintings.
And we haven't even gotten to process and the importance of process and how important process was to post-minimal artists. And but it's also a perfect example. If painting is covering a canvas with pigment, I think these paintings of David's just exemplify that in similar to Twombly, but Pollock also, and Milton Resnick in a sense too.
When the last thing I would say about the issue of illusion is that we also started to think about illusionism versus illusion. Yes. So illusionism being when you're trying to fool someone into creating a spatial depth, and illusion being just an inevitable, not a trick, but an inevitable part of human perception, of seeing that you find space and make space when you look at things, whether it's because of value contrast or a bump in the canvas or a drip, whatever it is, and that's okay.
And Christopher's right. It's surprising now to look back and to see that people would have thought these paintings too illusionistic. Mm-hmm. And I was really heavily criticized by colleagues for that. And often they would use Judd as an example of someone who had no illusion. Now, I claim to be seeing illusions in Judd, which are, of course, there, part of our natural perception. Mm-hmm. And what Judd was talking against was not illusion, but illusionism.
Yes.
And it's an important distinction that people weren't making at the time.
Yes, because people were really, and maybe this is super boring, but if this is a room full of painters, we can indulge ourselves a little bit, but that people were pushed to extremes, so that extreme of anti-illusion, of absolute materiality, and that the more nuanced people like Judd, even of that generation, didn't really believe in that total absoluteness of abstraction, materiality versus illusionism, representation, pushed to those extremes.
I'm struck now, thinking about it, that Marden's panel paintings were illusionistic.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yet he was a highly held example of someone who was painting in a non-painting time as well. So I'm a little, I think the whole, sounds like a somewhat dubious argument at the time.
Well, it sure looks strange and wrong to me now, and I think if you read criticism of those Martins, they never talked about the depth of them or the relation to your body or all these other qualities that are so important to me now and were then, and I was seeing them, and people were telling me, well, that's not what's important about the Martins and the Judds and the other work, and I think that's what makes it good work.
I mean, I want to make sure that we started a little bit late, and I want to make sure there's time for questions, but I just want to touch on some of the other issues that came up, and we'll just sort of go by them. One is process. Early Joel Shapiro, 400 blows, just hitting something over and over again and what it looks like after you've hit it a certain number of times. So again, here's process almost without image. Chris Burden, just chance and tossing those giant iron bars off a hill. And then the process in the body, again, an early Joel Shapiro piece that most people don't know, that's he recreated with great pleasure for the show at Gagosian, tossing the wooden mannequins. Early Charles Ray, also in the show at Gagosian. So the implied body in all of this, like in the Martin David was talking about. The way process comes out as image. In Dieter wrote, this is also in the show at Gagosian, it's a squashed banana that is a process and an image created through process. Also, early Joyce Penzato drawing, and there are very few of them. This is an early one from 1975, where you can see the process, again, not that split of extremes, it's a representation, but it also speaks to process and hand making.
And the studio school was
Yeah, so
75. Joyce was studying with Sloman here at the studio school at the time.
and you can see you'll see in the exhibition a beautiful Penzato painting. And I just wanted to show an image of that split that David was talking about. It was in a destroyed two canvas painting. It was in the Whitney Biennial in 1975.
This is one of the strangest experiences of this, of watching this show develop. I tried to locate each of my paintings, and I have a notebook with a number and where the painting is, and I tried to track them down. And somehow I kept going over this painting. This is number 48, I think. And somehow I never brought it up, never looked into it. It turns out, and then Katy asked for the catalog from the Whitney Biennial, and there it was, the painting that was in the show. And I realized what had happened, that I put this painting in the show. Everybody hated it. I got criticized from everybody. The critic Peter Sheldall, who was very supportive of me then and had written a good review of the show, said I should have switched it out and put one of the 5-panel paintings. But this was the painting chosen by Marcia Tucker, and I got discouraged by the reception and didn't want to face it again. It came back to my studio while the show was up at Susan Caldwell. I kept it for a year and then destroyed it.
Bad decision.
Very bad decision. And now I think it's maybe the best painting, the most forward-looking painting of that time. And it's one that I'm trying to repaint. And all of this is very interesting for me because you have to repaint them not thinking about what they look like, but how they relate to the body. And the marks on the left have to do with an arm. The mark on the right has to do with legs, because you put the brush down and you stand up as you're making the mark. So it's like a full body. And I don't think I understood at the time what I had done, but now I relate it to other work like the Factum 1, Factum 2 of Rauschenberg, And a sense of endless painting. Painting can go on forever. That's in some of the Lozano paintings, for example. So I'd love to be able to redo it, and I'm trying to do it, but it's not easy. It's not
The
easy.
different moments, like you can't
Yeah.
go back into the river at
Yeah.
the same point. But it is, the second one is obviously, and I say it's a copy, and then David says that's wrong, so it's not a copy, but it's a version of the first one, painted through physical memory, not through visual copying. And it's another example of not being at those two extremes, where we really felt like this is a moment where, at the cusp of a moment between what has been called modernism or high modernism and then postmodernism, or whatever that was, we don't use that word anymore, about that becomes something that's about repetition and image and something that is iterable. And so that this work, in a funny way, is right on the edge of those, being between those two things. And Christopher's generation is really being able to make that work and see that work, as well as the pictures generation work at the same time, and put that together with painting, led to someplace very different. So could you talk a little bit about the work that comes right after for you, Christopher, and then we'll open it up for questions about James Nayer's and some of your generation of artists, and who you were looking at right after that 1975 show in the late 70s.
Oh, boy. James's film is from 75, but I was not aware of it till
You saw it right.
much.
Yeah.
Well, let me see.
Oh, you sure it's not 77?
Maybe it's 77 even. So I was definitely not aware of it in 75. But I was aware of James as a filmmaker by the late 70s, but for different work. He was part of a group of Super 8 filmmakers who, it was the new cinema, and they were crossover artists from the no-wave music world. But that was an important group of filmmakers for me. And I think the red painting of James's is also late 70s, from a few years later. But I know James from the late 70s, always an important artist for me. As a big influence in some of the same ways David's paintings. I don't think I need to say much more than that.
I mean, I think it's unusual. Again, this is work that's been largely separated. This is Pendulum from the show that's been separated. One is the ABX works that from Pousset d'Art, Twerkov, Gustin, Resnick, separated into one thing, and then with this sort of later work at another extreme. Yeah,
this was part of why I was surprised and had trouble seeing David's work as Californian, because I came to New York in this time, and it was such a specific time in New York, especially the later 70s, 77, 78, and there was so much going on, and well, in a sense, it was a dividing time between generations, I guess. But New York was a heady place in the late 70s. A lot happening in all kinds of different ways. So there's James's work, Pendulum, which is in the show, and it's very physical in the way and abstract in the way that David's paintings are. And then you're talking about the new cinema. This was the new cinema. This was a feature film of James's from that time.
I've never seen this, Christopher, but do you know?
Oh my God, it's
my son.
You haven't lived to
my
see
son.
this film.
I've got my son and my godson are both actors in the film.
Oh yes, James mentioned that.
Yeah, so I have to see it.
It's a scene in the. Is it this? Not the Singer Building. What's the? It's the.
No one's told me. I have to see it.
It's the building. Remember we talked about Magoo's, because that was a bar where David had a painting. in the 70s. It's a big building across from there, which has a top floor that has a room with a cupola that was, I think, abandoned at the time. James actually broke in for a weekend and filmed a good. It's a Caligula story shot on Romanesque New York sets, and that room, it's a very tough film because it's shot with sound on the Super 8. You can't hear a word in that room because it's all echo.
So how did you connect this work at all? Or like you were the same person in 1975 and 1977. How did you?
Maybe not.
Maybe not. So
Yeah.
what happened?
Well, I was 20, 21, 22. I was still, trying to find myself.
So then Basquiat.
Well, Basquiat also was very much a part of that same time, if not. He was also very good friends with most of the filmmakers. I don't think he was in any of the new cinema films, but shortly after.
And so we talked a little bit about some of the directness that you had seen in David's work, in that earlier work, staying constant, but then not the prohibition against.
It's hard to describe it,
storytelling.
but and James actually changed the opening sequence, but the original Rome 78 starts with the credits, and he edited with the camera. And when you started a cheap old Super 8 camera, it made a loud pop on the recording. And so the beginning of the film is this pop, and you see a name of an actor and another pop, and it's startling, and it's as well. It's very similar to your paintings. It has the same.
Fascinating.
Yeah, he's looking for the original sequence. I thought it was. Well, I had 15 years after this, so in the early 90s, the films were important to me in the way David's paintings were. So I had worked with James and Eric Mitchell to. They were not available even on VHS at the time. So I helped them transfer 4 of the more important films from this time. So some of it is put together from pieces.
And you had gone from, and I guess I wanted to get just to your early mature work, and you had gone from this with the sort of, I think can you tell us what this is? And this was the work right out of the school?
This is also 75, actually. I don't have the paintings. I found slides while we were working on this project. It's wax. I was learning from Bryce Martin and Jasper John. So I have to say that the 70s with painting, people were more open to working with different. I remember many painters who were working on aluminum. There was a whole group of painters who were David's age who were working on shaped canvases and 3-dimensional canvases. There was, and obviously I had not been told about illusionism. I didn't realize I was supposed to avoid it. And the reason the paintings don't exist is I spent a year and a half in the country working in a barn in New England, and I left for the holidays and came back, and it must have been below 0, and all the wax had come off my masonite panels and sat in little piles on the floors in front of the paintings. They looked a little bit like your paintings would have looked if you didn't set them down to dry.
And so how did you get from there to
Oh my God! I mean, it took 20 years
to the early. These are those first
10
paintings.
10 years to
Yeah.
some of this.
8 years. Yeah. Right, from 75 to 83.
4 was the show
Okay.
cable.
So what happened when you suddenly, these are almost recognizably what we would see as, like I can imagine someone guessing, oh, this is early Christopher Wool. You know, like a multiple choice art history quiz.
There was much in between, and thankfully things you would not recognize as mine, and there was much in between this and what I consider non-student work or something. But I wanted to show, particularly the upper right corner. I don't think I was thinking of David's paintings at the time, but I think I was aware that this image I was making had some of David's left to right, top to bottom composition. And I certainly was aware with the painting that's in the book, that composition, and actually that comes from a work on paper from the mid-'80s. So I was not seeing David's paintings, but I was remembering them for their illusionistic qualities, actually.
You talked a little bit about suddenly realizing Basquiat was making exciting work, Robert Gober was making exciting work, and suddenly it was a moment of pressure for you that pushed your work forward. Yeah.
I guess about this time, particularly Bob Gober, I knew him, and we were doing studio visits with each other every so often. And when Bob started doing the sinks, it was an enormous breakthrough for him, but it really shook me up. It was the first time I saw an artist my generation actually accomplish something on that level, and it was startling. I was kind of pissed in my pants for a second, I think. Shook me up. And James was accomplished as a much younger person, but I always was most I guess you'd say most influenced by the artists who were my age. If an older artist accomplished something, I was less.
You said you'd gone from being the youngest guy in the room always to suddenly being almost too old.
Yes.
Yes. Just for the students in the audience.
Yes.
So.
That came up with Basquiat, a curator who's still around said, "Oh my God, you're almost too old now," because Basquiat was so young. I was, I don't know, in my late 20s before I'd had any exhibition, which was Basquiat was in his late teens and showing 5 years before that.
So I think the painting that Christopher was talking about is this one, which comes from one of those. It's a more recent work from one of those earlier drawings. And I wanted to show the room at Gagosian that has Joyce's work next to Warhol in the far left, but Christopher in the middle. And it was so funny to realize that that's the same paint you're using with Joyce.
Joyce and I work with the same materials. We've been aware of that for a long time.
But it's, for me to see two people who had started out here when they were so young, and that 40 years later, you said, in a way, we're still studio school artists.
Well, and the black and white, I don't know if that's still true, but Mercedes and her emphasis on drawing was both about line, but also she was not a colorist, and neither am I. And I guess not Joyce either. But also, I think the painting of mine there, I think more closely represents something similar to what David was doing than the one where the image looks like it. This also was done very quickly. There was not much room for erasure or going back or changing. And I think you overstated it because you showed me in the paintings where you would change things. It was there were areas that you said you would scrape down and apply, still wet into wet, but redo areas.
I guess I meant I would redo the whole painting. I couldn't really redo an area, but maybe.
Then I misunderstood, but
Yeah.
I'll
I think so, unless
the
I
Guggenheim painting? when we
got
looked-
away with some cheating that I
I
didn't
think
realize
you
I
did.
had and don't want to remember, but I think the Guggenheim painting, I did scrape it down and then repaint it several
Okay, maybe I
times.
misunderstood, but essentially a similar way of working. And my idea, if there's an idea there at all, was really about covering
Yeah.
in some kind of basic, simple way.
And I took a careful look at the painting, and I especially like that the drips occur when the paint goes over the earlier paint. So it's a part of the ground that's less absorbent. And
We'll have to have this conversation
Okay.
afterwards.
Super nerdy.
This is it.
So let's just end here and open it up. This is David's studio where he made that work from 1974 to 1975, and where he's still working through those paintings. So it's nice to know.
With the original drips there,
With the
right?
original drips, in 20 years, maybe we'll have to do it again. So,
And look at the hole at the edge of the wall there.
yeah.
When the electricity went out and I had to run an extension cord in, that was my way of getting the extension cord through the wall. I just pounded a hole with a hammer and then stuck it through. And there's some of that in the paintings, that determination to
That
get it
directness.
done.
And
that
I think you can
directness.
see it resurfacing in some of the more recent work. So please, let's open it up to the people who have questions for David and Christopher, or people who have to run away.